Hello friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. My name is Thorne Ellery, and I've been doing cave rescue diving for 17 years. People usually ask why I do this work, as if it's a matter of courage or heroism. It's not. This job is about precision, protocol, and managing your own fears while keeping someone else alive in an environment designed to kill you both. I tell people it's like being a surgeon who operates in the dark, underwater, with a timer counting down to 0. Most nod and change the subject. They don't really want to know. The call came in on a Wednesday afternoon in late March. I was in my garage, servicing regulators. Mindless work that lets you think about other things. My phone buzzed with the incident commander's number. Before I answered, I already knew it would be bad. They don't call me for the easy ones anymore. The victim was a recreational diver who'd gone into a sump passage alone, against every rule we teach. His buddy had waited at the surface for 40 minutes before calling for help. That 40-minute delay meant we were already working against probabilities that made my stomach tight. The site was a karst system about 90 miles north, a place I'd dived once before during a training exercise. The topside team had already established a perimeter when I arrived. I could see the sheriff's department vehicles, the volunteer search and rescue trucks, and a news van that had somehow beaten me there. The incident commander met me at my truck before I'd even killed the engine. He was a former paramedic named Stevens who'd moved into coordination work after losing feeling in his hands from too many cold water extractions. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. Single diver, male, mid-30s, entered the system at 1300 hours. His buddy says he was planning to push a restriction about 300 feet back. The buddy stayed at the entry pool because his ears weren't clearing. Smart guy. Stevens' sarcasm was thick enough to cut. We've got one other certified cave diver on scene, but she's not rescue rated. I need you to do the assessment. I suited up with the efficiency of repetition, each movement automatic. Dry suit, harness, primary light, backup lights, primary reel, safety reel, manifolded doubles with 32% nitrox, stage bottle with 50% for decompression if it came to that. My backup diver would be the other certified diver Stevens mentioned, a woman I'd met at a conference 2 years back. She had good skills but limited experience in rescue scenarios. That meant I'd be going in first, doing the assessment, making the critical decisions. The entry pool was murky with disturbed silt, a bad sign. Someone had thrashed around in here, maybe the victim, maybe the panicking buddy. I clipped off my primary reel to a bolt on the limestone wall, running the line through my fingers as I descended. The visibility improved as I moved deeper, settling into the familiar green-gray world of cave diving. My light beam cut through the water, illuminating the guideline that someone had previously run through this system. The line was taut and well-placed, which meant the missing diver had at least known basic protocol. At 200 feet in, I found his first mistake. A line arrow pointing in the wrong direction. Not dramatically wrong, but enough to confuse someone in a silt-out. Someone had removed it from the main line and placed it on a side passage that dead-ended after 50 feet. Whether it was the victim or another diver from weeks ago, I couldn't know. But it meant that if he'd gotten turned around, if visibility had collapsed, he might have followed that arrow thinking it led to the exit. I checked my pressure gauge. Still good. I continued forward, sweeping my light systematically across the passage. The restriction he'd reportedly been trying to push came up faster than I expected. The passage necked down to a gap maybe 18 inches high and 3 feet wide. You had to remove your tanks to fit through, pushing them ahead of you while pulling yourself forward on the rock. It was the kind of squeeze that made your chest tighten even when everything was going right. I found him on the far side of the restriction. He was wedged in a vertical chimney just beyond the squeeze, his tanks still on his back, regulator still in his mouth. His eyes were open behind his mask, but they weren't seeing anything anymore. His pressure gauge showed 1100 psi, enough air to have made it out if he'd been able to move. But he couldn't move. The chimney was a false passage, a dead end that angled up 15 feet before tapering into solid rock. He'd swum up into it, probably disoriented from the restriction, and then couldn't figure out how to reverse course in the narrow space. Classic entrapment. His fins were tangled in his own guideline, which had somehow wrapped around his ankles during his attempts to turn around. I approached slowly, checking for any sign of life I might have missed. But the stillness of his body, the way the water had already begun the work of erasing him, there was no question. My job now wasn't rescue, it was recovery. I took photos with the underwater camera attached to my harness, documenting the position, the entanglement, the gauge readings. The incident commander would need this for the report. The family would need it for closure, though I doubted the photos would bring any comfort. The recovery itself took 90 minutes. I had to cut away his guideline, carefully extract him from the chimney in segments, tanks first, then body, controlling the descent to avoid stirring up silt. My backup diver met me at the restriction and helped pass the body through. We moved in silence, communicating only through hand signals and the occasional touch on the shoulder. There's a rhythm to body recovery that's different from rescue work. Slower, more deliberate. You're not fighting against time anymore. Time has already won. We brought him to the surface just after nightfall. The family wasn't there, which was a mercy. The coroner's team took over from there, and I spent the next hour debriefing with Stevens, walking him through what I'd found. The wrong arrow, the false passage, the entanglement, each point on the chain of decisions that had led to death. Stevens took notes, his face neutral, professional. He'd seen this before, just like I had. Could he have saved himself? Stevens asked. I thought about that question for a long time. If he'd recognized the false passage early, yes. If he'd stayed calm enough to work out the entanglement, maybe. But that chimney, once you're up in there and you realize you're trapped, panic makes the decisions. And panic always makes the wrong ones. I drove home in the early hours of morning, still wearing my dry suit because I couldn't muster the energy to change. My wife was asleep when I got there. I stood in the shower until the hot water ran out, trying to wash away the memory of those open eyes, that stillness. But some things don't wash away. They accumulate like limestone deposits in your mind, layer by layer, year by year. The next morning, I got a call from the incident commander again. "We've got another one," he said. "Different system, about 40 miles east. 2 divers this time. Went in yesterday evening and haven't come out." I told him I'd be there in an hour, because that's what you do. You go back into the dark, into the places that kill people, and you try to bring them home. Sometimes you succeed. Sometimes you find them too late. But you always go back. The second site was worse. A flooded mine system that had been partially mapped but never fully explored. The 2 divers were experienced, both rescue certified, which made their disappearance more troubling. Good divers don't just vanish. They leave traces, clues, lines to follow, unless something goes catastrophically wrong. I descended into the entry shaft with my backup diver, a young guy from the county task force who'd been diving caves for only 3 years but showed solid judgment. We found the primary guideline intact, running deep into the system. At 400 feet, we hit the first problem, a silt-out so complete that visibility dropped to zero. Someone had stirred up decades of accumulated sediment, turning the water into a thick soup. We switched to touch contact, moving along the guideline by feel alone. The line led us to a junction point where two passages split off. One line went left, one went right. Both were marked with directional arrows, but something was wrong. The arrows pointed in opposite directions on the same line. Someone had gotten confused, placed markers incorrectly, or, and this was the thought that made my chest tighten, someone had deliberately sabotaged the navigation. I signaled my partner to stay at the junction while I explored the left passage. The silt was thinner here, visibility improving to maybe 5 feet. I found the first diver 300 feet down the passage. He was sitting on the floor of the cave, back against the wall, regulator out of his mouth. His pressure gauge read 0. His eyes were closed, which was unusual. Most drowning victims die with their eyes open, searching for the surface that isn't there. But his expression was almost peaceful, resigned. Next to him, scratched into the limestone with a knife or tool, were words. Wrong turn. 37 minutes, sorry. He'd known he was going to die. He'd sat down, conserved his air for as long as possible, and when it ran out, he'd accepted it. The level of mental control that required. I couldn't decide if it was remarkable or horrifying. Probably both. I documented the scene and continued down the passage, looking for the second diver. The passage terminated in a collapse after another 100 feet. Fresh rock fall, probably triggered by the diver's movements or bubbles. The second diver was under the collapse, only one arm visible in the rubble. Recovery would require specialized equipment and days of work. I marked the location and headed back. At the junction, my partner signaled frantically. He'd found something. We followed the right-hand passage together, moving slowly through the clearing silt. 200 feet in, we found evidence of a camp. Empty air tanks, an abandoned reel, and scratched into the wall, a different message. Day 3. Air gone. Tried both passages. No exit. Waiting. Day 3. The divers had been missing for less than 24 hours. This message was old. Someone else had died here weeks or months ago, and their body had never been recovered. The divers we were looking for had found this chamber, found this message, and panicked. Made the wrong choice. Followed the wrong line. We surfaced, and I delivered the news to Stevens. One body recoverable, one buried, and evidence of at least one more victim we didn't know about. He looked at me with tired eyes and asked the question I'd been asking myself. How many more are down there? I didn't have an answer. These systems are massive, unmapped, constantly changing. Bodies could be anywhere. And every body we found raised the question of how many we'd never find. The recovery operation took 5 days. We brought out the first diver. We excavated enough of the collapse to confirm the second diver was deceased and photographed the scene, but extracting the body would have required destabilizing the entire passage. Too dangerous, the family was informed. They weren't happy, but they understood. Sometimes the cave keeps what it takes. On the 6th day, we found the third victim, an older diver, equipment dating back to the 90s. His body had mummified in the cold water, preserved almost perfectly. His tanks were full. His gear was functional. He'd died of hypothermia probably after getting lost and exhausting himself trying to find the exit. The message on the wall made sense now. Day 3. He'd survived for 3 days before the cold took him. I stopped taking recovery calls for 2 months after that. Told Stevens I needed a break, needed to reset. He understood. He'd been where I was, staring into the dark and wondering why we bother. But the calls kept coming, and eventually I started answering again. Because someone has to. Someone has to go into the places that terrify everyone else and try to make sense of the senseless. Last month I got called to a system I'd never dived before. A solo diver had gone in, experienced and well-equipped. His truck was found at the trailhead. His entry log showed he'd gone in at dawn, but he never came out. I descended into the entry pool and found his guideline, perfectly placed, leading into the dark. I followed it for 600 feet, through restrictions and chambers, past side passages and false leads. The line ended at a wall, just stopped. No marker, no note, no body, just a line tied to a bolt in solid rock. I searched the area for an hour, checking every crack and crevice. Nothing. I surfaced and reported to Stevens. The line ends, but he's not there. Stevens looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. What do you think happened? I thought about all the bodies I'd found, all the ways people die in caves. Entrapment, drowning, disorientation, equipment failure, exhaustion. But this was different. This was a line that led nowhere. A diver who vanished without trace. And I realized, standing there in my dripping dry suit with my mind full of dark water and limestone, that maybe I didn't want to know. I think, I said slowly, that some caves don't give back what they take, and maybe that's how it should be. Stevens didn't push. He closed the case as a presumed drowning, body unrecovered. But sometimes I think about that line, ending at the wall. And I wonder if the diver found a passage I missed, a gap in the rock too small to see. Or if he's still down there, swimming in the dark, following a line that goes nowhere, forever. I still take calls. I still go into the caves. But now, sometimes, I find myself hesitating at the edge of the dark, wondering what's really down there. Wondering if all the bodies we find are the only ones waiting. Wondering if the caves aren't just passive spaces, but something more. Something that learns, that remembers, that keeps score. My wife asks me why I don't quit. I tell her it's the money, the sense of purpose, the need to help people, all true. But the real reason, the one I don't say out loud, is simpler and more disturbing. I need to know. I need to see what's down there in the dark. I need to find the missing pieces. Even if those pieces are bodies. Even if those pieces are me someday. Because that's what cave diving is, really. It's not about exploration or rescue or recovery. It's about confronting the parts of the world that refuse to be known, that resist understanding, that swallow people whole and never explain why. And every time I clip off my line and descend into the black, I'm asking the same question. Is today the day I don't come back? So far, the answer has been no. But I've seen enough to know that eventually, inevitably, the answer will change. The cave will keep me, like it kept the others, and someone else will descend into the dark, following their own line, and they'll find mine, ending somewhere it shouldn't, leading nowhere. Just another mystery in the depths, just another question the limestone refuses to answer. Until then, I keep diving, keep searching, keep bringing home the ones I can and documenting the ones I can't. It's not heroic, it's not even particularly noble. It's just what happens when you spend enough time in the dark. You become part of it, and it becomes part of you. And somewhere in that exchange, you lose the ability to tell where you end and the cave begins. My name is Muriel Sutter, and I learned everything important about cave rescue on a night when I should have said no. The call came at 11 p.m. on a Thursday in February. I was off rotation, technically, finishing a glass of wine and halfway through a documentary about deep-sea exploration. The irony of watching people explore one hostile environment while being asked to enter another wasn't lost on me. The incident commander's voice on the phone was tight, controlled in that way that means everything is barely holding together. 3 divers trapped, rising water. Flash flood prediction upgraded to certainty in the next 2 hours. I had 90 minutes to reach the site, assess, and execute a plan that would either save 3 lives or add mine to the count. The system was one I'd trained in but never run a rescue operation through. A network of sumps and air chambers that wound through a mountain ridge for over 2 miles. Beautiful in summer, when the water was low and clear. Deadly in spring runoff, when snowmelt turned the passages into high-pressure sluices. The 3 divers were students from the university, part of a research team studying aquifer dynamics. They'd gotten their permissions, filed their dive plan, done everything right except check the weather forecast for the mountains 70 miles upstream. A warm front had hit the snowpack. Rapid melt. The water in the system had already risen 3 feet in the past hour and was still climbing. I arrived on scene to organized chaos. The topside coordinator had set up incident command in a gravel parking area near the trailhead. Equipment was staged, medical personnel were on standby, and a hydrologist from the university was delivering a rapid-fire assessment of the water dynamics that made my stomach drop. The flood pulse hadn't peaked yet. When it did, in approximately 90 minutes, the water level in the entry sump would rise an additional 8 to 12 feet. The air chambers where the divers were trapped would flood completely. After that, their only option would be to attempt a dive exit through passages they'd never practiced, in zero visibility, with water moving fast enough to rip equipment from their hands. The coordinator, a woman who'd run mountain rescue operations for 20 years, laid it out plainly. We need them out before the peak. After that, we're looking at body recovery, not rescue. Can you do this? I wanted to say no. Every instinct trained into me over a decade of cave diving screamed that this was a suicide mission. But I looked at the 3 backpacks lined up near the entrance, the water bottles and energy bar wrappers, the evidence of people who'd started their day thinking about science and adventure, not drowning in the dark. I said yes. My support diver was already on scene, a calm veteran who'd done flood extractions before. We suited up in silence, checking each other's equipment with the kind of methodical care that becomes religious when mistakes mean death. Manifolded doubles, full redundancy on lights and regulators, 3 reels between us, cutting tools, lift bags, enough equipment to handle multiple failure scenarios. My primary light felt heavy in my hand, heavier than usual, or maybe that was just the weight of knowing what we were about to do. The entry pool was already transformed from the placid basin I remembered from training dives. The water was the color of chocolate milk, churning with sediment and debris. Visibility would be 0. We'd be navigating entirely by guideline and feel, in current strong enough to pull us off course. I clipped my primary reel to the entry bolt, tested the line tension, and dropped below the surface. The world became brown chaos immediately. My light beam penetrated maybe 6 inches before being swallowed by the suspended silt. I found the permanent guideline by sweeping my hands in front of me, pulled myself hand over hand into the current. The first sump passage was a 70-foot dive to the first air chamber. In training, with good visibility, it took 3 minutes. Now, fighting current and navigating blind, it took 12. My breathing was controlled, mechanical, but I could feel my heart rate elevated. The current was stronger than predicted, trying to push me sideways into the passage walls. I had to maintain constant tension on the guideline to avoid being swept into side passages or slammed into obstacles. My support diver stayed close, his hand occasionally touching my fin to confirm he was still with me. We emerged in the first air chamber gasping not from exertion, but from the sheer mental effort of the passage. The chamber was smaller than I remembered. The water had risen at least 4 feet since my last dive here 6 months ago. What had been a comfortable space with 10 feet of airspace was now a claustrophobic pocket with maybe 3 feet between water and ceiling. And it was still rising. I could see the wet marks on the walls showing where the water line had been 5 minutes ago, 10 minutes ago, an hour ago. Watching it climb was like watching a countdown clock. The divers we were looking for were in the 3rd air chamber, 2 more sumps away. We had to keep moving. The 2nd sump was longer, deeper, more technical. 120 feet with a restriction halfway through that required removing tanks and pushing them ahead of you. In good conditions, it was challenging. In flood conditions, in zero visibility, it was the kind of passage that killed experienced divers. I felt my way to the restriction, found it half choked with debris that had been swept into the passage by the current. Branches, mud, what felt like part of a tree root system. I had to clear it by feel, pulling away obstructions while maintaining contact with the guideline, all while my air consumption ticked steadily higher from the stress and exertion. The restriction itself was a nightmare. I couldn't see the gap, couldn't judge its size or orientation. I had to strip my tanks, push them through by feel, then pull myself after them with the guideline as my only reference. The rock scraped my dry suit. I felt something tear, felt cold water begin seeping in. Not a catastrophic failure, just a slow leak that would become a problem in 20 minutes, 30 if I was lucky. I got my tanks back on, checked that my support diver had made it through, and we continued to the 2nd air chamber. If the 1st chamber had been claustrophobic, the 2nd was a coffin. The water line was now less than 2 feet from the ceiling. The air itself felt thick, heavy with carbon dioxide that had nowhere to vent. This chamber would be completely submerged in less than an hour. We didn't pause, didn't waste time. I found the guideline leading to the 3rd sump and descended immediately. This passage was the longest, 200 feet with multiple turns and a section that angled steeply down before rising back up to the final chamber. I'd practiced it dozens of times in clear water. Now, I navigated by memory and touch, counting my pull strokes on the guideline to gauge distance, feeling the angle of the passage to estimate my position. Halfway through, the current shifted. Instead of pushing against us, it suddenly pulled, trying to suck us deeper into the passage. A reversal flow. The flood pulse was interacting with the cave's natural hydraulics in unpredictable ways. I felt my support diver's hand grip my ankle, a signal to stop. We hung on the guideline, bodies horizontal in the current, while I tried to process what was happening. If the flow was reversing, it meant water was backing up somewhere in the system. Pressure building. The kind of pressure that could turn a manageable passage into an impassable siphon in minutes. I made a decision. We couldn't retreat. The passages behind us were likely even worse now. We had to push forward, get to the divers, and execute the extraction before the system became completely unnavigable. I signaled my support diver to continue and pulled myself deeper into the passage. The current fought us every foot. My arms burned from the constant tension on the guideline. My air consumption was climbing into the danger zone. I was running calculations in my head, third's rule be damned. We'd blown past our turn pressure 5 minutes ago. This was survival now, not protocol. We broke the surface in the 3rd air chamber and found them. 3 divers huddled on a small ledge, water up to their chests, their lights creating a small pool of illumination in the darkness. They'd been trapped for 4 hours, watching the water rise, knowing that help might not come in time. When they saw us, I saw relief and terror in equal measure on their faces. Relief that someone had come. Terror that it might not matter. I didn't waste time with explanations or comfort. We have 30 minutes, maybe less. The passages you came through are flooded and zero visibility. You're going to follow my guideline out. Stay in physical contact at all times. If you lose the line or lose contact, stop moving and wait for me to find you. Do exactly what I say, exactly when I say it. Questions? The lead diver, a woman maybe 10 years younger than me, asked the only question that mattered. What if we don't make it? I looked at her directly. Then we all die together, so we make it. Understand? She nodded. We organized the extraction train. Me in front, then the 3 trapped divers, then my support diver bringing up the rear. I explained the restrictions, the current, the fact that they would be diving blind. I showed them how to maintain contact on the guideline, how to signal if something went wrong. Then I looked at my pressure gauge, did the math one more time, and knew with absolute certainty that we didn't have enough air. Not for all of us. Not for a safe exit. We descended into the 3rd sump. The current had intensified, the reverse flow creating a washing machine effect that tumbled us against the walls. I felt bodies behind me, hands gripping my fins and harness, trusting me to navigate through conditions where trust was the only thing we had left. The passage seemed longer than I remembered, the turns more complex. I counted pull strokes obsessively, trying to match memory with reality, but the current made distance impossible to judge. 70 strokes, 80, 90. How far had we come? How far was left? My primary light died, just blinked out, taking my main reference point with it. I switched to my backup, a smaller light with weaker illumination, but it barely mattered in the 0 visibility. I navigated purely by feel now, one hand on the guideline, the other sweeping ahead to feel for obstacles. Behind me, I felt someone's breathing accelerate into panic speed. Short, rapid breaths that would burn through their air in minutes. I reached back, found their shoulder, squeezed hard. A reminder, slow down, stay calm, trust the process. The breathing slowed fractionally. Not calm, but controlled. Good enough. We reached the restriction. This was where it would get dangerous. I had to talk 3 inexperienced divers through removing their tanks in 0 visibility, in strong current, in a space that felt like being buried alive. I positioned the first diver at the gap, used hand signals and physical guidance to show them how to strip their tanks, how to push them through, how to follow. They hesitated. I felt their fear through their trembling hands. I gave them a choice through touch, do this, or stay here and die. They chose to move. The tanks scraped through. The diver followed, disappeared into the restriction. I counted seconds, waiting for them to clear. 30 seconds, 60. Too long. They should be through by now. I pulled myself to the restriction and found the problem. The diver was stuck. Their harness had caught on something, maybe a rock projection, maybe a piece of debris. They were wedged in the narrowest part of the restriction, unable to move forward or back. I could feel their body thrashing, panic overriding training. This was how people died, stuck in restrictions, burning through air, making the problem worse with every movement. I reached into the gap, found their harness, felt for the snag. My fingers were clumsy in the thick gloves. I couldn't get enough dexterity to work the clip. I had to remove my gloves. The water was cold enough to hurt, cold enough to stop fingers working in minutes. But I didn't have minutes, I had seconds. I found the snag, a D-ring caught on a rock outcrop. I twisted it, pulled, felt it come free. The diver shot through the restriction like a cork from a bottle, swept forward by the current. I hoped my support diver would catch them on the other side. I replaced my gloves with hands already going numb and guided the next 2 divers through the restriction. Both made it without incident, though each took precious seconds we didn't have. I followed last, my tanks scraping hard enough to worry about valve damage, and emerged into the second air chamber to find disaster. The chamber was gone, completely flooded. What had been 2 feet of airspace was now solid water. The flood peak had arrived early. We had no air pockets left between us and the exit. It was one continuous sump now, over 400 feet of blind navigation and zero visibility, and heavy current with no safe stops, no breathing room, no margin for error. And at least 2 of the divers I was escorting were showing signs of hypoxia or panic. Their movements were erratic, their breathing audible through their regulators even underwater. I made a decision that would either save us or kill us. I pulled my pressure gauge close to my mask, doing the math by feel since I couldn't see the numbers clearly. I had maybe 800 psi, enough for me to exit alone maybe. Not enough for 5 people. My support diver would be similar. The 3 we were rescuing probably had less. We needed to share air, pool our resources. It was dangerous. Increased risk of confusion, entanglement, loss of the guideline. But it was our only option. I gathered everyone together by touch, arranged us into a tight group. I showed them through hand signals how we'd breathe. 2 breaths from your reg, pass it to the next person. Keep moving, keep following the line. My support diver took the lead, his air supply slightly better than mine. I took the rear, making sure no one got left behind. We moved as a cluster, a single organism with multiple bodies, sharing air in a rotation that had to be timed perfectly to avoid anyone blacking out. The first sump passage back to the entry seemed infinite. Every few pull strokes we'd pause, exchange regulators, breathe, continue. My lungs burned from the shallow breathing. My hands were completely numb. I couldn't feel the guideline anymore. Couldn't tell if I was holding it or if it had slipped away. I navigated by faith and terror. The current shoved us constantly, trying to separate us. I felt someone slip away from the group, their hand losing contact. I lunged blind, caught what I hoped was a fin, pulled them back into the cluster. We couldn't afford to lose anyone. We didn't have time to search. If someone drifted away, they were gone. My support diver's light began to flicker. His battery dying. Soon, we'd be in complete darkness, not just practical darkness from the silt, but absolute darkness. The kind that makes you lose sense of up and down. I checked my own backup light. Still functioning, but dim, I made it the center point, told everyone through touch to orient on its glow. It wasn't much, just a weak, amber reference in the brown chaos, but it was something. In the sensory deprivation of the cave, something was everything. We reached what should have been the entry pool. Should have been, but the current told a different story. Instead of slackening as we approached the exit, it intensified, pulling us not toward the surface but sideways, into a passage I didn't recognize. The flood had changed the cave's hydraulics entirely. Water was flowing through routes that didn't exist in normal conditions, creating new passages or opening old ones that had been dry for years. We were being swept off course, away from the mapped exit, into unknown territory. I made a choice. Let the current take us, or fight back to the guideline and the known exit. Fighting would cost air we didn't have. But going with the current meant abandoning navigation, abandoning protocol, abandoning everything except hope that the water was flowing toward an exit somewhere. I held the group together. Let the current take us. We tumbled through the water like leaves in a stream, bouncing off walls, dragged through passages too fast to map or remember. My pressure gauge showed 200 psi. Emergency reserve. Not enough to matter. Then I felt it. A change in the water. Warmer. Moving faster. And light. Not from our lights, but from above. Natural light filtering down through murky water. We were near a surface, a different exit point than we'd entered through. I kicked hard, pulling the group with me, fighting the current that wanted to drag us past this opening. We broke the surface in a pool I'd never seen before, surrounded by trees and open sky, gasping and coughing and alive. The debriefing took hours. The 3 rescued divers were hypothermic. One had symptoms of arterial gas embolism from the rapid ascent. All were traumatized. My support diver and I were little better. I'd torn my dry suit in 3 places, had moderate hypothermia, and had used up more than 5 years of luck in 90 minutes. The incident commander was both relieved and furious. Relieved we'd survived, furious at the risks we'd taken. She was right to be furious. We'd violated every protocol, pushed every limit, made decisions that should have killed us. But we'd also brought 3 people out alive. In cave rescue, you live with that contradiction. The university shut down the research program. The hydrologist who'd provided the flood prediction was investigated for negligence, though the charges didn't stick. The cave system was closed to diving indefinitely, marked as too unstable during runoff season. I testified at the inquiry, explained my decisions, defended my support diver against accusations of recklessness. We were cleared of wrongdoing but flagged as high-risk operators, a designation that meant fewer calls, more oversight, more questions before every deployment. I didn't care about the designation. What bothered me was the math. I'd had 800 psi at the final decision point. I'd surfaced with less than 50. Somewhere, in those 400 feet of blind navigation sharing air with 5 people, I'd been operating on empty. My regulator should have been drawing nothing but vacuum, but it kept delivering air, kept letting me breathe, kept me conscious long enough to reach the surface. The technician who serviced my rig after the rescue found nothing wrong. The tanks weren't overfilled. The gauges were accurate. The air I'd breathed in those final minutes simply shouldn't have existed. I told myself it was an anomaly, a quirk of pressure differentials or tank configuration. But late at night, when I replay the rescue in my mind, and I replay it often, I come back to that impossible air. Where did it come from? How did I breathe when physics said I shouldn't? And the question that really haunts me: what would have happened if I'd checked my gauge in that moment and seen it was empty? Would I have panicked? Would I have drowned? Would the rescue have failed? Or does the gauge show what you need to see, what you can handle knowing, rather than what's actually there? I still take calls, still do rescues, but now I don't trust my gauges the way I used to. I watch them obsessively, cross-checking against time and depth and breathing rate, trying to catch them in a lie. Because if they lied once to save my life, they might lie again. And next time the lie might be in the other direction. Might tell me I have air when I don't. Might promise safety when there's only drowning waiting at the end of the line. My support diver quit 3 months after the flood rescue. Found a job teaching diving in warm, clear water where the biggest danger was jellyfish stings. I don't blame him. He'd seen what I'd seen, breathed that impossible air, and decided he didn't want to know if it would happen again. I made a different choice. I keep diving into flooded caves, keep navigating by faith and protocol through conditions that should be fatal. Because someone has to. And because I need to know if the gauges will lie for me again. If the universe has more impossible air hidden somewhere in its calculations, reserved for moments when physics should result in death, but doesn't. Last month I did another flood rescue. Different cave, different victims, but the same rising water and zero visibility. I brought them out with 300 psi to spare. Normal margins. Everything by the book. No anomalies, no impossible air. Just good planning and clean execution. The incident commander praised my professionalism. I smiled and accepted the compliment. But I know the truth. The universe isn't consistent in its mercies. Sometimes it bends the rules and saves you with air that shouldn't exist. Sometimes it follows the rules exactly and lets you drown. You never know which version you'll get until you're already committed, already in the dark, already breathing from a tank that might be full or might be empty regardless of what the gauge claims. And that's the real terror of cave rescue diving. Not the darkness or the current or the restrictions. It's the uncertainty. It's diving into an environment where the physical laws aren't as absolute as we pretend, where gauges might lie, where impossible things happen just often enough to make you question everything. Every dive is a negotiation with reality, and sometimes, when the stakes are high enough and the margins thin enough, reality negotiates back. Offers you a deal, saves you when it shouldn't, and never explains why. I'm still waiting for the explanation. Still diving, still rescuing, still checking my gauges and wondering which reading is true. The one that says I have enough air, or the one that says I'm already breathing the impossible. Because in the caves, in the flood-dark sumps where people go to die and sometimes inexplicably live, both readings are equally real and equally false, and the difference between them is just another mystery the water refuses to answer. My name is Garrick Vale, and I've done 63 cave rescues in my career. 62 of them followed a predictable pattern: get the call, assess the situation, execute the recovery, document the lessons learned. The 63rd taught me that some situations don't fit patterns. Some caves don't release their secrets even when you bring the victim out. Sometimes what you rescue is just a body with a pulse, and the person who went into the cave never comes back at all. The call came during a training weekend. I was in the mountains with 8 other rescue divers, practicing long penetration techniques in a system we all knew well. When the incident commander's number appeared on my phone, I almost didn't answer. We were off the clock, off duty, supposed to be focused on skills development. But you don't ignore those calls. You never know when the 10 seconds you save by answering immediately will be the difference that matters. I stepped away from the group, took the call, and felt the weekend slip away into the category of things that didn't happen. The victim was a solo diver who'd gone into a remote system 20 miles from our training location. His name was on a permit filed 3 days earlier. His truck was found at the trailhead with a note on the dashboard: back by sunset Wednesday. It was Thursday morning. The permit listed his intended route: a deep penetration dive to a terminal sump that had only been reached a handful of times. Maximum depth 280 feet, total penetration distance over 3,000 feet, multiple stages and decompression stops required. It was the kind of dive that only a few dozen people in the world were qualified to attempt. I knew the system by reputation only. It had a name among the rescue community, though officially it was just a catalog number. We called it the Throat because the main passage narrowed progressively as you went deeper, like descending into a gullet that didn't want you there. The geology was unusual. Instead of the typical limestone, this system cut through layered shale and metamorphic rock that created razor-sharp protrusions and unstable walls. Divers who'd penetrated to the end described it as beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. One of them, a friend of mine, had told me after his only dive there, "It's like the mountain is trying to swallow you, and you get the feeling it's not done digesting the last person who came through." I mobilized my team from the training weekend. We had the gear, the skills, and most importantly, we were already acclimated and prepared. We reached the site by early afternoon. The incident commander on scene was a state coordinator I'd worked with before. Competent, but clearly unsettled by something. She pulled me aside before I'd even finished unpacking my truck. "There's something you need to know before you go in," she said. "We sent a camera drone down yesterday, remote-operated, fiber-optic tether just to scout the entry passages. It got to about 800 feet before the tether snapped. But before we lost signal, it captured something. I need you to watch this." She pulled out a laptop and showed me the footage. The camera perspective was dizzying. Narrow passages, sharp rock, the telltale markers of a guideline running deeper into the system. At 700 feet, the camera's light illuminated something on the cave floor. It took me a moment to process what I was seeing. Equipment, a deco bottle, a light, a reel, all arranged in a neat pile. Not scattered like they'd been dropped. Arranged, like someone had carefully staged them. At 800 feet, just before the feed cut out, the camera caught a glimpse of something else. A marking on the wall, carved or scratched into the rock. The image quality was poor, but it looked like text. One word, deeper. "That's his equipment," the commander said. "Serial numbers match his permit application. But if he staged it at 700 feet, that means he continued beyond that point without his deco gas, without backup lights, without the ability to run a safety reel. That's not just risky, that's suicidal." I studied the image, trying to make sense of it. Experienced divers don't abandon critical equipment. Not unless something has gone seriously wrong, or seriously right, in a way that makes them stop thinking rationally. I've seen it before, divers who get so focused on reaching an objective, so committed to pushing one more restriction, or seeing what's one more chamber deeper, that they start making trade-offs that would horrify them on the surface. The cave offers them a choice: turn back with gear intact, but goals unmet, or press on light and fast and damn the consequences. Some divers choose wrong. "How much air was in his staged bottles?" I asked. "The deco bottle was full, never used. The state park team checked it this morning." That made it worse. He hadn't used his decompression gas because he'd never intended to, which meant either he'd planned a one-way trip or he'd believed he could get out some other way. Neither option was rational. Both options were terrifying. I suited up for a reconnaissance dive, not a rescue. My job was to reach the staged equipment, assess the situation, and determine if extraction was even possible. I took one support diver with me, a woman named Chen, who had more deep cave experience than anyone else on the team. We loaded up with stage bottles, redundant everything, enough gas to handle extended decompression if needed. The entry pool was unremarkable, a clear basin surrounded by trees, deceptively peaceful. You'd never know it led to one of the most demanding cave systems in the region. The descent was gradual, the passage sloping down at a gentle angle that lulled you into a false sense of accessibility. The rock formations were beautiful in the light, stacked layers of sediment compressed over millions of years, now exposed and shaped by water. We followed the permanent guideline, checking tie-offs and markers as we went. Everything looked normal, well maintained. At 400 feet, the passage began to narrow. At 500, it narrowed more. The throat was starting to close. By 600 feet, I was moving through spaces that required careful body positioning to navigate. The rock pressed in from all sides, sharp edges catching on equipment if I wasn't precise. My breathing was controlled, automatic, but I was aware of my heart rate climbing. This was the kind of passage where you didn't want to panic, where panic would wedge you into a position you couldn't escape from. Chen stayed close behind me, her light giving me a reference point, a reminder that I wasn't alone down here. We found the staged equipment at 700 feet, exactly where the camera had shown it. The deco bottle, the light, the reel, all neatly arranged on a flat section of cave floor. I examined each piece. No damage, no signs of struggle or emergency. He'd placed them deliberately, carefully. This wasn't an abandonment born of panic. This was a decision. I found his dive slate nearby, plastic waterproof board used for underwater notes. There was writing on it, cramped and hurried. Staged and complete. Main objective, 570 feet ahead. Estimate 35 minutes bottom time. Deco on exit. Feeling strong. Will update at Stage 2. Stage 2. He'd planned multiple equipment caches, which meant he'd known this dive would require staged decompression on the way out, had known he was pushing well beyond safe limits, and had done it anyway. I took photos of everything, documented the scene, and continued deeper. The passage narrowed further. At 800 feet, I found the marking the camera had captured, carved into the shale wall, rough but legible, deeper. And below it, an arrow pointing down into a section of passage that kinked sharply, disappearing into darkness my light couldn't fully penetrate. Chen signaled to check my gas. I was into my first stage bottle, consuming faster than planned because of the depth and stress. We had enough to continue, but not much margin for problems. I signaled back, continue slowly. We descended through the kink and found ourselves in a different environment. The passage opened up, the restrictions giving way to a larger chamber, but the rock changed. The layered sediment gave way to something darker, more crystalline. The walls glittered with mineral deposits that reflected our lights in strange patterns, and the water felt different, colder, denser, like it had weight beyond its physical properties. At 900 feet, we found Stage 2, another cache of equipment, more substantial this time. 2 stage bottles, backup lights, a full reel with hundreds of feet of line. And another slate. Stage 2 complete. Terminal sump located 280 feet ahead. Depth increases to 285 feet. Bottom time extended to 60 minutes. Deco obligation now 140 minutes. Calculated risk acceptable. The chamber beyond is worth it. We'll surface tomorrow. If not, remember me at my best. That last line froze me. If not, remember me at my best. Not if I don't make it, not if something goes wrong, but if not. As though he'd already accepted the possibility of not returning, had made his peace with it, had decided the chamber beyond was worth dying to see. I'd read the same sentiment in the journals of mountaineers who died near their summits. The willingness to trade existence for achievement, life for legacy. It was the mentality that got people killed in the mountains. And in the caves, it got them killed in ways that left no bodies to recover, no evidence except abandoned equipment and cryptic messages. I checked the line leading deeper. It was his personal line, not the permanent guideline. He'd run it himself, which meant he'd been first into whatever lay ahead. I made a decision. Chen and I would push to the terminal sump, locate the victim if possible, and make an assessment. If he was alive, we'd initiate extraction. If not, we'd document and exit. We had enough gas for that plan if everything went perfectly. And in caves, nothing went perfectly. But I've learned to live with imperfect margins. The passage to the terminal sump was the most demanding diving I'd ever done. It narrowed to a gap that required removing tanks and pushing them ahead, then slithered through a series of S-curves that forced complete body flexibility. The depth was increasing steadily, 240 feet to 60 feet, 80 feet. At these depths, nitrogen narcosis became a factor. The gas you're breathing affects your cognition, makes you stupid in subtle ways. I caught myself making errors I wouldn't make at shallower depths, grabbing the guideline too aggressively, misjudging clearances. Chen tapped my tank, a signal to slow down. I complied, forcing myself to move deliberately instead of urgently. We reached the terminal sump at 285 feet. It was a silt-bottomed chamber, roughly circular, maybe 30 feet in diameter, and it was occupied. The victim was there, sitting upright on the cave floor, regulator in his mouth, eyes open behind his mask. His lights were off. He wasn't moving. I approached slowly, checking for signs of life. His eyes tracked my movement. He was conscious, alert. but completely still. I touched his shoulder. No response. I signaled, "Are you okay?" He blinked once, slow, deliberate. Then his gaze shifted, directing my attention to something behind me. I turned and saw what he'd come to see. The back wall of the chamber wasn't rock. It was ice, or something like ice. Translucent, layered, holding shapes within it. And the shapes were wrong. They looked like fossils, but from animals that couldn't have existed. Skeletal structures too complex. Symmetries that didn't match any known biology. And there were tools, or what might have been tools. Objects of worked stone and metal that showed evidence of deliberate manufacture but no recognizable purpose. They were preserved in the ice wall, suspended in perfect clarity, a window into something that shouldn't be there. I stared at it, trying to process. This cave was 10,000 feet into a mountain. The ice shouldn't exist at this depth, at this temperature. And the artifacts, if that's what they were, shouldn't exist at all. Not in this geology. Not in this age of rock formation. I looked back at the victim. He was still watching me, still motionless, and I realized the problem. He didn't want to leave. He'd found something impossible, something that rewrote the context of everything he understood, and leaving meant accepting he might never see it again. So he'd stayed, breathing his remaining gas, watching the ice wall, waiting for his air to run out or for someone to force him to surface. I checked his pressure gauge. 400 psi. He was minutes from running out. I switched his regulator to my octopus, sharing my gas, and signaled forcefully, "We're leaving now." He resisted, not violently but with passive refusal. He reached out and touched the ice wall, and where his glove made contact, the surface seemed to ripple. Not melt, not break, but ripple like water. Then it resolidified. He pulled his hand back and looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. Plea? Apology? Wonder? All of them? Chen helped me break his inertia. We gripped his arms and pulled, dragging him away from the ice wall. He didn't fight us, but his body was rigid, locked into a posture of resistance. We got him to the exit passage and began the long ascent. At stage 2, we switched him to one of the cached bottles, restoring his air supply to sustainable levels. At stage 1, we picked up his deco bottle. The ascent became a calculated exercise in gas management and decompression scheduling. We had to make multiple stops, hanging in the water column for minutes at a time, while our bodies off-gassed the accumulated nitrogen. The victim remained passive, compliant but not participatory. He breathed when signaled, moved when directed, but initiated nothing himself. We surfaced after nearly 7 hours underwater. The sun had set. The staging area was lit by portable floodlights that made everything look harsh and unreal. Medical personnel swarmed the victim, checking vitals, starting interventions. He was hypothermic, dehydrated, showing signs of decompression stress despite our careful ascent. But he was alive, and he was out. The incident commander approached me while I was being checked by the medics. "Did you find anything down there? Anything that explains why he stayed so long?" I thought about the ice wall, the impossible artifacts, the way the surface had rippled under his touch. I thought about the look in his eyes, the expression that said he'd seen something worth dying for, and I thought about the fact that some things aren't explainable, aren't provable, aren't real in a way that survives the transition from 300 feet of depth and darkness to the ordinary world of floodlights and paperwork. "He reached the terminal sump," I said. "Stayed too long. Classic case of target fixation. He's lucky we got there when we did." The commander nodded, satisfied with the explanation that fit her paperwork. Chen looked at me with an expression that said she knew I was leaving something out, but she didn't press. We packed up our gear in silence. The victim was transported to the hospital for observation. The cave was closed pending a safety review. Everything proceeded according to protocol. 3 days later, I got a call from the hospital. The victim had been cleared medically but was refusing to leave. He'd barricaded himself in his room and was demanding to speak with me. Against the advice of the hospital administration, I went. I found him sitting on his bed, staring at nothing, looking like he hadn't slept since we'd brought him up. "You saw it," he said when I entered. Not a question, a statement. "I saw something," I admitted. "I don't know what. It's still there. It's waiting. Someone needs to document it, study it, understand what it means." He looked at me with wild eyes. "We found evidence of something that shouldn't exist, something that changes everything, and we just left it there. We left it there because staying would have killed you. Staying longer would have killed all of us. Some things are worth dying for." I sat down across from him. Maybe. But documenting unknown artifacts isn't one of them. If that ice wall and what's in it are real, they've been there for thousands of years. They'll be there when we can mount a proper expedition with the right equipment and safety protocols. Going back alone, with barely enough gas to reach it, isn't documentation. It's suicide. He laughed, bitter and sharp. "You think anyone will believe us? You think any university or research institution is going to fund an expedition based on the ravings of a diver who spent too long at depth? They'll say it was narcosis, hallucination, oxygen toxicity. They'll explain it away, and that'll be the end of it." He wasn't wrong. I'd already filed my official report, and I'd left out the ice wall entirely. Described the terminal sump as empty, except for the victim. Chen had done the same. We'd made the decision together, wordlessly, understanding that some observations don't belong in official documents. Not because they're untrue, but because they're unprovable, and unprovable observations from extreme depth become evidence of nothing except the observer's compromised judgment. "So, what do you want from me?" I asked. "Go back. Document it properly. Take cameras. Take samples if possible. Prove I'm not crazy." He pulled out a waterproof notebook, the kind divers use for underwater notes. It was full of sketches, diagrams, measurements. I drew everything I could remember. The shapes in the ice, the arrangement of artifacts, the dimensions of the chamber. But drawings aren't enough. I need you to prove it's real. I looked at the drawings. They matched what I'd seen, which meant either we'd both experienced the same hallucination, or we'd both seen something genuine. Neither option was comforting. I told him I'd think about it. Left the hospital and spent the next week trying to convince myself to forget, to let the memory fade, chalk it up to narcosis or stress, or the tricks the mind plays in extreme conditions. But the drawings haunted me. The precision of them, the detail, the absolute certainty that they represented something real. I went back to the cave 2 months later. Solo dive, unofficial, off any rescue roster. I didn't tell Chen, didn't tell the incident commander, didn't file a permit. Just loaded my truck with enough equipment to reach the terminal sump and do a proper documentation dive. I told myself I was verifying a safety hazard, checking for unstable ice formations that could threaten future divers. But I knew the truth. I was going back to see if it was real, if I'd seen what I thought I'd seen, if the impossible artifacts frozen in ice were memory or reality. The descent was familiar now, the passages and restrictions mapped in my muscle memory. I reached stage 2 in good time, reached the terminal sump with gas to spare, and found nothing. The chamber was empty, the walls solid rock. No ice, no artifacts, no evidence that they'd ever been there. I spent 20 minutes searching, checking every surface, trying to find some sign of what I'd seen. But the cave had reset itself to ordinary. just rock and water and darkness, refusing to yield its secrets a second time. I surfaced with more questions than answers. The victim's drawings remained in my possession, detailed and specific, describing something that apparently no longer existed. Chen never asked me about what we'd seen, and I never volunteered the information. The cave remained closed for another year, then reopened with additional restrictions. The victim disappeared from the area, moved to a different state, stopped diving according to the grapevine in the cave community. But sometimes I think about that ice wall, about the shapes preserved within it, about the artifacts that suggested intelligence and manufacture, but from a context so alien that recognition itself was a struggle. And I wonder if the cave shows different things to different people, or if it shows the same thing once and then hides it, or if what we saw was never really there, just a shared delusion born of depth and darkness, and the human need to find meaning in the void. I still do cave rescues, still navigate the same passages, follow the same protocols. But now I'm aware that some caves hold more than geology. Some caves keep secrets that surface only briefly, under specific conditions, for specific observers. And whether those secrets are real or imagined becomes irrelevant compared to the certainty that seeing them changes you. Makes you question not just what you saw, but what you're capable of seeing. What the brain produces under stress versus what the environment actually contains. The victim's final words to me, when I told him I'd gone back and found nothing, were, "It chose to show us once. Maybe that's all we get." One glimpse of something that shouldn't be there, preserved in a mountain, waiting for someone to see it and carry the knowledge back. Even if no one believes us, even if we start to doubt ourselves. The glimpse happened. The moment of wonder was real, even if the evidence disappeared. Maybe he's right. Maybe the point isn't proof, but experience. The minute I stood in that chamber, staring at impossible artifacts, feeling my understanding of reality flex under the pressure of observation. That minute was real, regardless of whether it left evidence. And in a career full of rescues and recoveries, of bringing people back from places designed to keep them, that minute of impossible wonder might be the thing I remember most clearly. Not the successful extractions or the careful safety protocols, but the moment the cave showed me something it shouldn't have, and then took it away, leaving me with nothing but drawings and questions and the absolute certainty that some truths don't survive the return to surface. My name is Aisling Kerrigan, and I learned the meaning of true disorientation on a Tuesday morning that started with coffee and ended with me questioning whether I'd ever actually left the cave at all. They say that in zero visibility, in absolute silt-out conditions, your senses become unreliable. They tell you in training that you can't trust your inner ear, can't trust your sense of up and down, can't even trust the evidence of your own hands on the guideline. What they don't tell you is that sometimes the guideline itself becomes suspect, that sometimes you emerge from a cave physically intact, but mentally uncertain whether the person who surfaces is the same one who descended. The call was routine by rescue standards, a diver overdue from a training dive in a well-mapped system. His buddy had surfaced on schedule, but the missing diver had signaled to continue to the next chamber. When he didn't appear at the agreed meeting time, the buddy waited 30 minutes before calling for help. Good protocol, good response time. Everything suggested a straightforward extraction scenario. Equipment problem, maybe, or mild entrapment in a restriction. Nothing in the initial briefing suggested what it would become. I arrived on scene with my usual partner, a methodical diver who treated every rescue like a mathematical problem to be solved. We'd worked together for 8 years, developed the kind of nonverbal communication that makes complex operations possible. The incident commander was someone I'd met at a conference but never worked with. Competent, from what I'd heard, but with a reputation for rigid adherence to protocol even when situations demanded flexibility. She briefed us on the missing diver's profile: experienced, full cave certified, diving familiar equipment in a system he'd explored a dozen times before. His last known position was in a chamber roughly 400 feet from the entrance, accessed through 2 short sumps and a restriction that required careful but not extreme maneuvering. We suited up and reviewed the dive plan. My partner would take primary on navigation. I would focus on victim assessment and extraction logistics. We loaded up with standard rescue gear plus additional line and markers in case the existing guideline had been compromised. The entry pool was calm, visibility excellent, conditions about as favorable as cave diving ever got. I remember thinking this would be one of the easy ones. 3 hours, maybe 4, and we'd have the diver on the surface with nothing worse than wounded pride and a story about equipment failure. The first sump was unremarkable. We followed the permanent guideline through a gently curving passage that opened into an air chamber after about 60 feet. The chamber was small but comfortable, with enough space to stand waist-deep in water and breathe normal air. We checked our gauges, confirmed our gas management was on track, and continued into the second sump. This passage was longer, 120 feet, with a slight downward slope that bottomed out at 40 feet before rising again to the second air chamber. The restriction came midway through, a section where the ceiling lowered to within a foot of the floor, requiring you to flatten your body and pull yourself through on the guideline. We cleared the restriction and found ourselves in murky water. Not a complete silt-out, but visibility reduced to maybe 3 feet. Someone had recently passed through this section, stirring up sediment that hadn't fully settled. Not unusual in a training dive. Newer divers often move less efficiently, disturbing more silt. We continued slowly, maintaining contact with the guideline, sweeping our lights in careful arcs to maximize the little visibility we had. The second air chamber appeared gradually, the ceiling rising above water level, giving us another breakpoint before the final sump to the target chamber. The second chamber felt wrong immediately. The air was stale, heavy with carbon dioxide from poor ventilation. But more than that, the space felt smaller than it should have. I'd reviewed the survey maps before the dive. This chamber was supposed to be roughly 15 feet by 20 feet, with 10 feet of vertical clearance above the water. What we'd surfaced into was maybe 8 feet by 10, with barely 4 feet of airspace. I checked my compass, confirming our orientation. According to the instrument, we were exactly where we should be. But the chamber dimensions didn't match. My partner signaled concern. I signaled back, continue but alert. We descended into the third sump, which should have led to the chamber where the missing diver was last seen. The guideline was intact, running true into the murk. Visibility was worse here, maybe 2 feet, and deteriorating as we moved. We were in full, silt-out conditions now, navigating entirely by touch on the line. My partner was ahead of me, feeling his way forward when I felt the line go slack. Not broken, not tangled, just slack, like the tension had disappeared. I gave it a gentle tug. Nothing. I pulled harder. The line came toward me freely, no resistance, no attachment to anything ahead. I caught up to my partner and signaled the problem. We were both holding sections of guideline, but the line didn't connect to anything forward or back. It was a loop, somehow, or we'd gotten turned around. Except, turning around in zero visibility on a guideline is essentially impossible if you're maintaining proper contact. The line itself prevents disorientation. That's its purpose. I checked my compass, still indicated the same bearing. I checked my depth gauge, 38 feet, which matched the surveyed depth of this passage. Everything said we were where we should be, except the guideline was telling a different story. We made a decision to surface, reset, and assess. But when we attempted to ascend, we found ceiling, rock, solid and continuous, where there should have been open water leading to an air chamber. My partner signaled emphatically, "Check depth." I checked, still 38 feet. But we were pressed against a ceiling that shouldn't exist. I fought down panic, forced myself to think systematically. We'd made an error somewhere, entered a wrong passage, followed a false line, gotten turned around despite precautions. The solution was to backtrack, return to a known position, start over. We turned back, following the guideline in what should have been the reverse direction. The line led us through murk and restrictions, past sections I didn't remember from the entry dive. After what felt like 10 minutes, but was probably less, we surfaced into an air chamber. Not the second chamber we'd left from, not the first chamber, but a different space entirely. This one was larger, maybe 20 feet across, with formations on the walls, stalactites and flowstone that created an otherworldly cathedral effect. Beautiful, but wrong. The survey maps showed no large decorated chambers in this system, nothing like what we were seeing. I checked my dive computer. We'd been underwater for 40 minutes, well within our planned time, but feeling much longer. My air consumption was elevated, stress breathing, despite efforts to control it. My partner was gesturing at the walls, at the formations, clearly as confused as I was. We should not be in this chamber. This chamber should not exist. Yet here it was, solid rock and mineral deposits, as real as anything I'd ever touched. We descended again, trying different passages from the chamber. One led to a dead end after 50 feet. Another looped back to the same chamber. A third opened into a sump that seemed to go on forever. We penetrated 200 feet before deciding that was wrong, that we were moving away from the missing diver, away from the entrance, deeper into a system that wasn't matching any mental map. We surfaced in the chamber again, now breathing harder, now genuinely worried about our own situation. We'd come to rescue someone and instead gotten lost in a system I'd been told was simple and well mapped. My partner signaled, "Deploy safety reel." Good thinking. We'd tie off in this chamber, run our own guideline, mark our own path, create a reference that we controlled, that couldn't be questioned or misread. He clipped the reel to a rock formation, tested the tie-off, and we descended with our own line unreeling behind us. This time, we moved with exaggerated care, checking every turn, marking every junction. We found a passage that felt right, slightly upward angle, right diameter, rock textures that matched my memory of the entry route. The passage led to another air chamber. This one matched the second chamber's described dimensions. Relief flooded through me until I saw the walls. They were marked, carved with scratches and symbols that looked like tally marks or crude maps. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, covering every accessible surface. Some were fresh, recent cuts through algae and mineral buildup. Others were old, partially obscured by new deposits. Someone had been here many times, marking the walls, marking their attempts to navigate out, marking days trapped. I couldn't tell. My partner was examining the marks closely, his light tracing the patterns. One set of scratches resolved into words. "Exit not where you think, follow the cold." Below it, different handwriting, fresher cuts. Followed cold, still here, day 2, and below that, barely legible. There is no day 2. Time doesn't work. I checked my dive computer again. 47 minutes elapsed. But my air consumption suggested longer. I was into my reserve, breathing gas I'd planned to have for the exit. My partner's gauge showed similar depletion. Either our stress was burning through air faster than calculation suggested, or we'd been down longer than our instruments indicated. Neither option was good. I signaled, "We need to exit now." My partner nodded, but his eyes behind the mask looked uncertain. Exit to where? Which passage? We chose the one that felt most familiar, following our own guideline back. It should have led directly to the chamber where we'd tied off. Instead, it terminated at a wall after 80 feet. Our line, which we'd carefully deployed and monitored, now ended at solid rock. No tie-off point, no chamber, just our reel attached to nothing, floating in the water. I pulled the line taut, felt resistance, followed it hand over hand back to its origin. The line was intact, continuous, but when I reached what should have been the tie-off chamber, I found open water. No chamber, no formations, just a wide sump passage extending in multiple directions. My partner grabbed my arm, pointed at his pressure gauge. He was at 800 psi, getting dangerously low. I checked mine, 700. We'd violated the rule of thirds badly. Enough air to get out if we found the exit immediately, not enough for extended searching. I made the hardest decision of my career. We had to find the missing diver now, or we had to abandon the search and focus on saving ourselves. I signaled, one more passage, 5 minutes. Then we exit by dead reckoning. We chose a passage based on water temperature. One route felt slightly warmer, the other noticeably colder. I remembered the carved words, "Follow the cold." Against all training that said cold water meant depth and danger, we took the cold passage. It descended steeply, the temperature dropping enough that I could feel it through my dry suit. At 60 feet depth, deeper than any point in the surveyed system, we found him. The missing diver was alive, sitting on the cave floor with his back against the wall. His eyes were open, tracking our lights. His regulator was in his mouth, still delivering air, but he wasn't moving. I approached, checked his gauge. 1200 psi, plenty of air. I signaled, "Are you okay?" He blinked twice, slow and deliberate. Then he raised one hand and pointed behind us, back toward the passage we'd entered from. His expression was terrified, but also resigned, like he'd accepted something horrible and wanted us to know before we discovered it ourselves. I turned to look where he was pointing and saw nothing unusual, just the passage we'd swum through, murky and dark. But when I turned back to the diver, he was pointing more emphatically. I looked again, and this time I saw it. The passage entrance was changing, not moving exactly, but shifting in subtle ways. The rock formations that framed it were rearranging themselves slowly, like time-lapse footage of crystal growth. Except this was happening in real time, fast enough to perceive if you watched carefully. The passage we'd entered from was sealing itself. My partner saw it too. He grabbed my arm, signaled frantically, "Exit now." I grabbed the missing diver, tried to pull him to his feet. He resisted with surprising strength, shaking his head violently. I signaled more forcefully, "We're leaving, come now." He finally moved, but with obvious reluctance, like he was afraid of what following us would mean. We started back toward the passage, all three of us, moving as fast as zero visibility and uncertainty allowed. The passage had narrowed considerably by the time we reached it. What had been a comfortable swim-through was now a tight squeeze. We had to remove tanks and push them ahead, contorting our bodies to fit through the gap. The rock felt warm to the touch, almost organic, like it was actively closing rather than just settling. We cleared the restriction and found ourselves in yet another chamber, one I didn't recognize. This one had multiple exits, 6 or 7 passages leading away into darkness. No markings, no guideline, no reference for which way led out. I checked my compass. It was spinning, the needle rotating continuously without settling. My depth gauge showed 45 feet, then 30, then 60, flickering between readings like it couldn't decide where we were. My dive computer had multiple error messages scrolling across the screen. All our instruments were failing simultaneously, or the environment itself had become incompatible with measurement. I looked at my partner. saw my own fear reflected in his eyes. We were lost, truly lost, in a system that was apparently breaking the rules of normal caves. The missing diver tapped my shoulder, got my attention, and made a series of hand signals I didn't recognize. Not standard cave diving signals, but something else, more complex. My partner watched, shook his head. He didn't understand either. The diver tried again, slower, exaggerating the movements. Then he gave up on signals and simply started swimming, heading for one of the passages with apparent confidence. My partner and I exchanged a look. We had no better options. We followed. The passage the diver chose was tight, restrictive, with sharp rock that scraped our equipment. My already damaged dry suit tore further, cold water flooding in. But the diver moved with certainty, like he'd been this way before, like he knew something we didn't. We followed for what felt like hours, but was probably minutes, through twists and turns that defied any mental mapping, until suddenly the water changed. It became clearer, warmer, the silt dispersing. My light beam reached farther. I could see formations ahead, and beyond them, the dim suggestion of natural light. We surfaced in the entry pool, the same entry pool we'd left from, now bathed in late afternoon sun. We'd been underwater for 6 hours according to the clock, though my dive computer still showed conflicting times. The incident commander was there with medical personnel, looking relieved and angry in equal measure. We'd been missing long enough to escalate to a major search operation, long enough that other rescue teams were being mobilized. She started asking questions immediately. Where had we been? What took so long? Why hadn't we deployed emergency markers? I couldn't answer coherently. My mind was still in the cave, still trying to process the chambers that shouldn't exist, the guideline that led nowhere, the passages that changed shape. My partner looked similarly shell-shocked. The missing diver said nothing at all, just sat on the rocks wrapped in an emergency blanket, staring at the cave entrance with an expression of profound relief and lingering terror. The debriefing was a disaster. Our story made no sense. We described chambers that weren't on the survey, passages that led in impossible directions, instruments that failed simultaneously. The incident commander listened with increasing skepticism, finally suggesting we'd all experienced narcosis, that depth and stress had created shared hallucinations. When I insisted the system itself had been different, had changed during the dive, she politely but firmly recommended I take time off, consider whether I was still fit for rescue work. My partner corroborated my account, which helped and hurt. Helped because I wasn't the only one claiming impossible experiences. Hurt because now there were 2 rescue divers with compromised judgment. 2 people who apparently couldn't be trusted to observe reality accurately. We were both placed on administrative leave pending psychological evaluation. The missing diver was less help. He refused to discuss what had happened, citing trauma and requesting privacy. His medical evaluation showed no signs of decompression illness or physical injury. Just extreme stress and what the psychologist called dissociative symptoms consistent with acute trauma response. I underwent the required psychological evaluation, answered questions designed to assess my grip on reality. I told the truth mostly, though I learned to frame it carefully. Instead of "the cave changed," I said, "My perception of the cave was unreliable due to stress and poor visibility." Instead of "instruments failed," I said, "Instruments gave readings I couldn't reconcile with my expectations." I passed the evaluation technically. The psychologist cleared me for return to duty with the note that I'd experienced situationally appropriate disorientation that resolved without lasting impairment. But I knew the truth. The cave had been different. Not my perception of it, but the cave itself. The passages had changed. The chambers had rearranged. The normal rules of space and navigation had broken down. And the most disturbing part wasn't the impossible geometry or the failing instruments. It was the carved warnings on the walls. Time doesn't work. Exit not where you think. Those hadn't been written by us. Other divers had been in that system, had experienced the same phenomena, had tried to warn whoever came after. And we'd found their warnings too late to avoid the same experience. I went back to the cave 3 weeks later, after my clearance but before I'd accepted any new rescue calls. I wanted to see it again, understand it, maybe find evidence that would vindicate what I'd reported. I brought cameras, better lights, multiple computers and compasses to document any anomalies. I dove with obsessive caution, mapping every turn, photographing every junction. The system was exactly as the survey described. Clean passages, logical layout, all chambers where they should be. No carved warnings on the walls, no mysterious decorated cathedral chamber. No passages that changed shape, just a normal, well-behaved cave that matched its documentation perfectly. I developed the photographs that evening, reviewed the footage. Everything normal, everything explainable. The cave had reverted to its mapped configuration, or had never deviated from it, or had shown its true nature only to divers meeting certain conditions I didn't understand. I couldn't decide which explanation disturbed me more. The missing diver called me 2 months later. He'd moved to a different state, stopped diving entirely. He wanted to talk, he said, needed to tell someone what had really happened. We met at a coffee shop, both of us uncomfortable in the ordinary setting, both still carrying the cave's darkness in our minds. He told me he'd been in the system for 3 days, not 3 hours. He'd watched his dive computer cycle through multiple days while he sat in that deep chamber, unable to find the exit, watching passages rearrange themselves every time he tried to navigate out. He'd accepted that he would die there, had made peace with it, had been preparing for the final moments when we'd appeared. But here's the thing, he said, leaning forward with intensity. When I checked the surface world after, only 3 hours had passed. 3 hours on the clock, 3 days in the cave. Time was different down there, and I think... He paused, wrestling with whether to continue. I think it's always different. I think that cave exists in multiple states simultaneously, and which state you experience depends on something we don't understand. Awareness, maybe, or consciousness, or just bad luck. I asked him about the carved warnings. He'd seen different ones than I had in different chambers. His warnings had been about not trusting the guideline, about passages that loop back on themselves, about chambers that only exist when you're not looking for them. He'd added his own warning before we'd found him, scratching it with his knife onto a rock surface. He showed me a photograph he'd taken on his final visit to the site, a year after the rescue. The chamber where he'd waited for death was there, unchanged, but his carved warning was gone, not weathered away or covered by new mineral deposits. Just gone, as if it had never existed. We talked for hours, comparing experiences, trying to build a coherent model of what had happened. We failed. The cave's behavior didn't follow any pattern we could identify. It was random, or responsive to factors we couldn't perceive, or operating under rules that didn't translate to normal physical laws. The only consistent element was that instruments failed. Perception became unreliable, and reality itself seemed negotiable in ways it absolutely should not be. "Are you going to keep diving?" he asked, finally. I didn't have an answer. I still don't. I've done 4 more rescues since that conversation, all in different systems, all completed without incident. But now, I'm aware that normal isn't guaranteed. That some caves might operate under different principles, might exist partially outside the physical laws I depend on. And that awareness changes everything. makes every dive a question rather than a procedure, makes every guideline suspect, every instrument reading provisional, every compass bearing a suggestion rather than a fact. My partner retired last year, cited family reasons, said he wanted to spend more time with his kids while they were young. But when we talked privately, he admitted the real reason. He couldn't trust caves anymore. Couldn't enter a passage without wondering if it would be the same passage when he tried to exit. Couldn't follow a guideline without remembering how ours had led nowhere. The doubt had made him hesitant, and hesitation in rescue diving gets people killed. Better to step away than operate with compromised confidence. I understand his reasoning, I share his doubt, but I can't step away, because now I know that some caves aren't stable, that some systems break the rules, and that means people who dive them need rescuers who understand what's possible, what's impossible, what's beyond both categories. I'm one of the few who've experienced a cave that doesn't behave, who've navigated through space that refused to make sense and survived. That experience, however traumatic, however unexplainable, is knowledge. And in rescue diving, knowledge is the only thing that might save the next diver who calls for help from inside a system that's decided to stop being normal. The incident commander who supervised that rescue still doesn't believe my account. She's convinced it was narcosis, stress, equipment failure, anything except what I claimed. And I can't prove her wrong. Can't take her into that cave and show her the impossible chambers because they don't appear on demand. They exist in moments, or for certain divers, or under conditions that seem random. All I have is my experience, my partner's corroboration, and the missing diver's testimony. 3 people who went into an ordinary cave and came back changed, telling stories that don't fit the physical world's rules. Sometimes I wonder if we actually made it out. If the surface we returned to is real, or if we're still down there, still lost, still trying to navigate through a cave that extends forever in directions that don't exist. Maybe that final passage the missing diver led us through didn't exit to the real world, but to a very convincing copy. Maybe the psychological evaluations and the debriefings and the return to normal diving are all just the cave's way of keeping us calm while it digests us slowly, the way spiders preserve prey in silk. I check for evidence constantly, look for inconsistencies in the surface world, test whether my instruments work properly in normal conditions, verify that time passes at the expected rate. Everything checks out, everything normal, which proves nothing. A sufficiently sophisticated simulation would pass all my tests, would create a surface world indistinguishable from reality. I could be living in that simulation now, typing this account, believing I escaped when in fact I'm still sitting on that chamber floor, regulator in mouth, watching passages rearrange themselves eternally. The only thing that gives me confidence I'm actually back is the fear. Real fear. The kind that wakes me at 3 a.m. with my heart racing, replaying the moment I realized the guideline led nowhere. A simulation wouldn't need to maintain that level of terror. It would let me relax, believe I'm safe, process the trauma and move on. But the fear stays fresh, stays immediate, like my body knows something my conscious mind doesn't. Knows that some boundary was crossed in that cave. Some point of no return was passed, and that the person who entered is not quite the same as the person who emerged. I'm scheduled for another rescue next week. Different system, different team, different victim. I'll go because that's what I do, because someone needs help and I have the skills to provide it. But I'll descend with the knowledge that caves aren't always caves, that passages can lead in impossible directions, and that sometimes the only way out requires following someone who's been lost longer than you have, trusting them to navigate what you can't understand. And if I find myself in a chamber with carved warnings on the walls, with passages that change shape, with instruments that contradict each other, I'll know I'm back in the space between spaces. The cave that exists when caves stop being simple holes in rock and become something else. Something that measures you, tests you, decides whether to release you or keep you forever in its shifting passages. And if I don't come back from that next rescue, if my team reports me lost in a system that shouldn't be dangerous, I'll know the answer. Know that the cave decided to keep me, or that I never really left, or that the boundary between trapped and free is more porous than we want to believe. The missing diver said something in our last conversation that I think about often. He said, "Maybe we're all still down there, every diver who's ever been in that cave, and what surfaces is just an echo, a copy that the cave releases to keep up appearances. The real us stays behind, mapping passages that lead everywhere and nowhere, following guidelines that never quite find the exit." I don't know if he's right, but I know that some part of me is still in that cave, will always be in that cave, following a line that led to nothing and trusting instruments that lied. And every time I descend into any cave anywhere, I'm aware that I might be returning to where I never left, completing a circle that started the moment I realized that up and down and forward and back are just suggestions that some spaces choose not to honor. And in those spaces, the only way out is through, or deeper, or not at all. My name is Calder Rook, and I've spent 19 years diving caves that most people don't know exist. The deep systems, the ones that require multiple days of staging equipment and planning, the ones where a single navigation error means you don't come home. I've seen a lot of things go wrong in those systems. Equipment failures, medical emergencies, judgment errors that compound into catastrophes. But I'd never seen anyone deliberately lie about which way was out until the incident at the karst system we called the Labyrinth. After that day, I understood that the most dangerous thing in a cave isn't the water or the rock or the darkness. It's the certainty that you know which direction leads to safety. The call came through the Regional Coordinator Network on a Saturday in October. A team of 3 divers had entered a system known for its complexity, multiple entrances, braided passages that connected in non-obvious ways, strong and variable current that changed direction depending on rainfall and seasonal water tables. The team had filed a comprehensive dive plan showing they understood the risks. They'd entered through the upper entrance, planned to navigate to a major junction chamber, and exit through the lower entrance 2 miles downstream. Solid plan, experienced team, conditions within acceptable parameters. But they'd missed their expected exit time by 4 hours, and attempts to raise them on the surface communication system had failed. I was called in as part of a 4-person response team. We divided responsibilities. 2 divers would enter from the upper entrance and attempt to backtrack the team's route. 2 would enter from the lower entrance and navigate upstream to the junction chamber. I took the lower entrance with a partner I'd worked with before, a woman who specialized in high-flow diving and had more hours in complex current conditions than anyone else I knew. We loaded up with enough equipment for a long search, multiple stage bottles, backup lights, extensive line marking materials, slates for underwater communication. If the missing team had gotten disoriented at the junction chamber, we'd need to conduct a thorough search of multiple passage options. The lower entrance was unremarkable, a spring basin that dumped clear water at a steady rate, the outflow of a massive underground drainage system. We descended into current immediately, the water pulling us downstream even as we tried to swim against it. The guideline to the junction chamber ran upstream for nearly 1,500 feet, requiring constant finning effort to make progress. My arms were burning within the first 5 minutes, my breathing rate elevated despite efforts to control it. Current diving is always exhausting, always pushing your body to limits that feel unsustainable. but you sustain them anyway because stopping means being swept back to the start. At 800 feet penetration, we encountered the first complication. The permanent guideline had a marker arrow pointing downstream, toward the exit we'd just left. That was wrong. Markers should point toward the nearest exit, and at this position in the system, the nearest exit was the upper entrance, upstream from our location. Someone had either placed the arrow incorrectly or had gotten confused about flow direction. In karst systems with variable current, it's possible to misread which way is upstream, especially if you enter during a flow reversal. But this marker had been placed on the permanent line, supposedly installed by the original exploration team who'd mapped the system thoroughly. My partner examined the arrow closely, then checked the survey notes we'd brought. According to the map, there should be no directional markers in this section of the passage. The guideline itself was supposed to be sufficient for navigation. This arrow was extra, added by someone after the original installation. She marked it with a distinctive wrap of bright line, creating a visual flag we could reference on the way out, and we continued upstream. Every 100 feet or so, we found another arrow. Every one pointed downstream, toward the lower entrance. And every one was wrong, or at least contrary to standard protocol. At 1,300 feet, we reached a junction where a side passage branched off the main line. The survey showed this as a dead-end lead, explored for maybe 200 feet before terminating in a silt collapse. But there was a guideline running into it, and on that line, another arrow pointing into the side passage with a notation scratched into a plastic marker. ALT, exit 950. Alternative exit, 900 feet. Except the survey was explicit. This passage didn't connect to surface. It was a dead end. Someone had placed misleading information at a critical navigation point. We made a decision to ignore the side passage and continue on the main line toward the junction chamber. But the wrong arrows bothered me. They weren't random errors or vandalism. They were systematic, placed at regular intervals, creating a consistent but incorrect navigation narrative. Someone had invested significant time and effort into marking the guideline in a way that would mislead divers. The question was why? Malice? Confusion? Or had the system changed since the survey, opening new passages or closing old ones, rendering the original map obsolete? We reached the junction chamber after 90 minutes of hard swimming against current. It was a large room, maybe 50 feet in diameter, with 5 passages branching off in different directions. The permanent guideline entered from the lower passage, our route, and the upper passage that led to the upper entrance. The other 3 passages were side leads, partially explored, marked with warnings about restrictions or dead ends. We surfaced in the air dome at the top of the chamber, a space with maybe 3 feet of clearance between water and rock ceiling. The air was stale, but breathable. The missing divers weren't there. No sign of them, no equipment, no markers indicating they'd passed through. My partner and I checked each passage entrance underwater, looking for any indication of which route they might have taken. The upper passage showed recent disturbance. Silt stirred up in a way that suggested people had passed through within the past few hours. We were about to head up that passage when we heard something. Muffled voices, coming from one of the side leads. We descended and followed the sound. The side passage angled down steeply, the current intensifying as we descended. At 80 feet depth, we found them. All 3 divers huddled together near a guideline that ran deeper into the passage. They were conscious, actively diving, but not moving toward any exit. When they saw us, their reactions were strange. Not relief, but something closer to resignation or embarrassment. I signaled, "Exit this way, follow us." The lead diver shook his head, pointed deeper into the passage. I signaled more emphatically, "No, exit behind us, follow now." He shook his head again, showed me his dive computer. The navigation function was active, showing a route that led deeper into the passage, not back toward the junction chamber. My partner intervened, grabbed the lead diver's arm, started pulling him toward the exit. He resisted, struggling against her grip. The other two divers moved to help him, creating a confused tangle of bodies and equipment in a passage too small for that kind of conflict. I separated them forcefully, got their attention, and wrote on my slate in large letters, "Survey says dead end. Exit behind us. Follow or stay." I held the slate in front of each diver's mask, making sure they read it. The lead diver wrote back, "Computer says exit ahead. Arrow agrees." He pointed at a marker on the guideline. Sure enough, there was an arrow pointing deeper, with a notation, "Lower exit 1200 Fifth." The same kind of false marker we'd been finding all through the system. But his dive computer, independent of any physical markers, was also indicating the exit lay ahead. That shouldn't be possible. Dive computers use compass bearings and depth to estimate position. They're not perfect, but they don't usually indicate exits in directions that lead deeper into cave systems. Unless his computer was malfunctioning, or unless the system's geometry was stranger than the survey suggested. My partner and I had a rapid underwater discussion via slate. We couldn't physically drag 3 unwilling divers back against strong current. We'd all exhaust our gas in the struggle. But we also couldn't let them continue into what the survey said was a dead end. The compromise: one of us would escort them deeper for 500 feet. If no exit materialized, we'd abort and force the issue of returning to the junction chamber. If an exit did appear, we'd call for a survey update and incident report. My partner volunteered to return to the junction and wait, conserving gas in case rescue became complicated. I would continue with the 3 divers. We descended deeper into the side passage, following the guideline and the misleading arrows. The current was punishing now, requiring all my strength to make forward progress. The 3 divers ahead of me were struggling visibly, their finning technique deteriorating from fatigue. At 500 feet penetration, we should have hit the dead end. Instead, the passage opened into a larger conduit, the current shifting from directly oppositional to cross-flow. We'd entered a different hydrological system, water moving perpendicular to our travel direction. And ahead, visible in our lights, was a passage that sloped upward. We followed the slope up, and at 600 feet from the junction chamber side passage, we surfaced in another air dome. Small, cramped, but definitely an airspace, and beyond it, another passage that clearly led to daylight. I could see the faint green glow of natural light through the water. We'd found an exit, one that wasn't on the survey, accessed through a passage that was supposed to be a dead end. The dive computers had been right, the arrows had been right, and the survey had been catastrophically wrong. The 3 divers surfaced with expressions of vindication mixed with exhaustion. The lead diver removed his regulator and said, "We knew there was an exit here. The arrows told us. Everyone said we were wrong, said we should turn around, but we knew." His confidence was absolute, unshakable. He'd trusted the markers and his instruments over the official survey, over the advice of the rescue coordinator, over the established knowledge of the system. And he'd been right. That bothered me more than if he'd been wrong. We exited through the new passage, emerging in a location about a mile downstream from the lower entrance. A hike through woods brought us back to the staging area, where the incident commander and the other rescue team were debriefing. The 2 divers who'd entered through the upper entrance had found nothing. The missing team hadn't gone that direction at all. Everyone was relieved the divers were safe, but the commander was also deeply confused about the route they'd taken. When I explained about the unmarked exit, the false markers that turned out to be true, and the survey data that was apparently incomplete, her expression shifted from confusion to concern. "That side passage was surveyed extensively," she said, pulling out the documentation. "Terminated in a collapse at 240 feet. Multiple teams confirmed it over 5 years of exploration. There's no exit there. There can't be an exit there. But there was. We'd swum through it, surfaced in it, walked back from it. The physical evidence was irrefutable, which meant either the survey was wrong, or the cave had changed, or we'd somehow entered a different passage that coincidentally aligned with the surveyed dead end. None of those options made sense, but one of them had to be true. The incident commander organized a verification dive for the following week. Full survey team, proper equipment, documentation protocols. I volunteered to participate, curious about what we'd find. The week felt long, filled with speculation and arguments within the cave diving community. Some people insisted we'd misidentified our location, that the exit we'd found was actually a known entrance that we'd confused. Others suggested the collapse that had terminated the original survey had recently cleared, opening access to previously blocked passages. A few suggested we were mistaken entirely, that fatigue and stress had made us misremember our route. The verification dive took place on a Sunday with perfect conditions. 6 divers total, divided into 2 teams, each with full survey gear and documentation protocols. We entered through the junction chamber and navigated to the side passage. The guideline was still there, running into the passage just as I remembered. The arrows were still there, pointing deeper. We followed them, measuring distance and depth carefully, documenting every turn and feature. At 240 feet, we found the collapse. Solid rock blocking the passage completely, no way through. The survey had been correct. The passage was a dead end. We spent an hour searching for alternate routes, checking every crack and crevice. Nothing. The passage terminated exactly where the survey said it did, which meant the exit I'd found, the passage I'd surfaced through, didn't connect to this side lead. But it had. I'd swum through it, followed the guideline, made the specific turns that led from junction chamber to exit. There was no ambiguity in my memory, no uncertainty about the route. I compared my dive computer's logs to the survey team's measurements. According to my computer, I'd penetrated 800 feet beyond the junction chamber through the side passage. According to the survey team, the side passage only extended 240 feet. A discrepancy of 560 feet. We surfaced in the junction chamber to discuss. The lead surveyor was diplomatic but skeptical. Human memory is fallible, especially in high-stress situations. You probably took a different route than you remember, maybe one of the other passages that loops back. It happens. The important thing is everyone's safe. But the 3 divers I'd followed, when interviewed separately, all described the same route I remembered. Same turns, same distances, same exit location. 4 independent accounts matching perfectly. That consistency argued against memory error or confusion. I went back to the exit point where we'd emerged, the location downstream from the lower entrance. It was there, exactly where I remembered. A small opening in a hillside, partially obscured by vegetation, with fresh scuff marks where we'd climbed out. I descended alone with a camera, following the passage upstream. It led to an air dome, just like I remembered. And beyond that, a passage that descended at the right angle, with the right current patterns. I followed it for 800 feet, until my gas management forced me to turn back. The passage kept going, deep into the hillside, toward where the junction chamber should be. But I couldn't complete the connection without violating safety protocols. The incident was closed with an inconclusive finding. The 3 divers had been located and extracted safely. The discrepancy between the survey and my reported route was noted, but unresolved. The commander updated the system's documentation with a warning. Passage navigation may not match survey expectations. Multiple conflicting reports. Divers should be prepared for unmarked junctions and should prioritize real-time assessment over pre-dive planning. It was a careful way of saying we didn't understand what had happened and couldn't guarantee it wouldn't happen again. I dove the system 3 more times over the following months, always entering through the lower entrance, always working my way to the junction chamber, always checking the side passage. Every time, it terminated at the collapse. Every time, the survey data matched reality perfectly. The passage I'd followed, the exit I'd found, remained inaccessible from the junction chamber. It existed as a separate system, or it had temporarily connected during some unusual hydrological condition, or my memory was wrong despite all evidence to the contrary. I couldn't determine which. The lead diver from the rescued team reached out to me 6 months later. He'd continued diving the system obsessively, trying to rediscover the route we'd taken. He'd found something, he said. Something that explained everything. We met at the site on a cold morning in March. He showed me his documentation, dozens of dives, meticulous measurements, current mapping at different times and water levels. He'd discovered that the karst system had multiple hydrological modes. During high water, certain passages flooded and became impassable. During low water, those same passages drained and became open. But there was a narrow window during transitional flow when passages that were normally separate temporarily connected. We dove during a transition, he explained. The water was dropping from high to low. For maybe 2 hours, passages that are usually isolated connected through transient sumps. The route you followed only exists during that window. Before and after, it's blocked by air on one side and water on the other. He showed me computer modeling that supported his theory, hydraulic calculations that predicted temporary connectivity at specific flow rates. It was elegant, plausible, and completely unverifiable without diving during the exact conditions he described, conditions that occurred maybe twice a year and couldn't be predicted precisely. I asked him about the arrows, the false markers that had turned out to be true. He hesitated, then admitted he'd placed them. He'd discovered the transient connection years ago during a solo exploration dive. He'd tried to report it, but without corroborating evidence, the survey team had dismissed his claims. So he'd marked the route, placed arrows and distance notations, hoping that someday other divers would find the connection and validate his discovery. The markers had been there for years, ignored by divers who trusted the survey over the arrows, until his team had chosen to follow them. "I saved you," he said with quiet intensity. "Your team was going to declare us lost, write it off as a dive accident. But I knew the way out, and I marked it, and it saved our lives." He wasn't wrong. If they'd turned back at the junction chamber, if they'd followed standard protocol and trusted the survey, they would have wasted gas-fighting current back to a known exit. By following the arrows, by trusting marked information over official documentation, they'd found a shorter route that reduced their risk. The unconventional choice had been the correct one. But it raised a question that troubled me deeply. When do you trust the markers? And when do you trust the survey? How do you distinguish between helpful information from previous explorers and dangerous misinformation? In this case, the arrows had been accurate, placed by someone with genuine knowledge. But in other cases, arrows could be wrong, placed by confused divers or deliberately falsified. The standard answer is to always trust the survey. Always follow the official documentation. But this incident had proved that surveys could be incomplete, that official knowledge could miss important details, that sometimes the unconventional choice was survival. I started paying more attention to non-standard markers in other systems. Arrows that didn't match surveys, notations that contradicted official distances, warnings that seemed excessive or misplaced. Most were errors or outdated information. But occasionally, I found markers that told stories the surveys didn't capture. A warning about seasonal current reversals in a system officially documented as low flow. An alternate exit notation in a cave listed as single entrance. Distance markers that showed a passage was longer than surveyed. Each one a fragment of knowledge from a diver who'd experienced something the official exploration hadn't documented. I began adding my own markers, carefully placed notations about conditions or routes that weren't in the surveys. I marked transient passages that only opened during specific water levels. I noted current patterns that changed seasonally. I documented alternate routes that were longer but safer than the official main line. Other divers started doing the same, creating a parallel navigation system that existed alongside the official surveys. We called them field markers, distinguished from the permanent guideline markers by color and material. And gradually, the community started paying attention to them, cross-referencing them with surveys, updating documentation when field markers revealed information the surveys had missed. But the question remained, what happens when field markers and surveys disagree? When an arrow points one way and the map shows another? I'd learned that surveys could be wrong, but I'd also seen countless examples of divers getting lost by following incorrect markers. There was no universal answer, no rule that always worked. Each situation required judgment, assessment, and the willingness to accept that certainty was an illusion. The best you could do was gather all available information: surveys, markers, current conditions, personal observation, and make the most informed choice possible. And sometimes that choice would be wrong, and you'd have to live with the consequences. The rescued diver's theory about transient connectivity haunted me. If he was right, if the cave system had multiple modes that connected different passages at different times, then every survey was just a snapshot of one moment in a dynamic system. The true configuration of the cave wasn't fixed but variable, changing with water levels and flow rates and seasonal factors. Navigation became probabilistic rather than deterministic. You couldn't know for certain where passages led, only where they'd led under similar conditions in the past. And if conditions changed during your dive, if the water rose or fell, or the current reversed, the passages might connect differently than expected. I tested his theory during the next known transition period, entering the system with careful timing to match the predicted window when transient passages should open. The side passage from the junction chamber was flooded but passable, the current manageable. I followed it 600 feet, reached a point where it should have terminated according to the survey. The rock face was there, the collapse clearly visible. But to the right, partially hidden by an outcrop, was a gap I'd never noticed before. It was small, barely large enough for a diver, filled with fast-moving water. I squeezed through, emerged in a larger passage I didn't recognize, followed it upward, and found the air dome and exit I remembered from months ago. The transient connection was real. The cave did have multiple modes, and the survey, while accurate for one mode, was incomplete for the others. I documented everything, took measurements, shot video. But when I submitted the information for survey updates, I got pushback. The survey team argued that transient passages weren't properly part of the cave system, that they were too variable and dangerous to document officially. Including them in the survey would create confusion, would lead divers to attempt routes that might not be open, would increase risk rather than reducing it. They had a point. How do you survey something that changes? How do you document a passage that only exists during a specific window of hydrological conditions? The answer was that you couldn't, not in any reliable way. The best you could do was note the possibility and warn divers that the system had more complexity than the static survey showed. I still dive that system regularly, still study its modes and transitions. I've found 3 more transient connections, passages that open and close with water levels, creating temporary routes through the mountain. Each one is marked with field markers, documented in personal notes, shared informally with other explorers. But they'll never be in the official survey because they can't be surveyed in any meaningful sense. They exist in the gaps between documentation, in the spaces where certainty gives way to probability, and maps become suggestions rather than definitive guides. The incident commander retired last year. In her final briefing, she told me something that changed how I think about cave rescue. She said, "We teach divers to trust the survey, to follow the guideline, to rely on established knowledge. And that's good advice 99% of the time. But the 1% of the time when it's wrong, when the survey is incomplete or the guideline has been compromised or the established knowledge doesn't match reality, that's when divers die. Because they've been trained to trust the system, and when the system fails, they don't know how to improvise. Your job isn't just to rescue divers, it's to teach them when to trust the map and when to trust themselves." She was right. The most dangerous thing in a cave isn't the environment. It's misplaced certainty. The belief that you know which way leads out, which markers are true, which passages connect. That certainty can save you when it's accurate. But when it's wrong, when the cave has changed or the survey is incomplete or the markers are lying, that same certainty becomes a liability. You need uncertainty, or at least the awareness that certainty is provisional. You need to be willing to question the guideline, challenge the survey, consider the possibility that what you know is wrong. I teach this now to new rescue divers. I show them the transient passages, the field markers that contradict surveys, the examples of caves that don't match their documentation. I make them uncomfortable with the idea that navigation is ever fully solved, and I tell them the story of following 3 divers into a passage that shouldn't have connected, trusting arrows that contradicted the survey, and finding an exit that officially didn't exist. I tell them, sometimes survival means ignoring what you know and following what you see. Sometimes the map is wrong, and the cave is right. And knowing the difference is the skill that keeps you alive. The 3 divers I rescued that day continue diving the system, mapping its modes, documenting its transitions. They've become experts in transient connectivity, in understanding how water levels affect passage accessibility. They've saved 2 other teams by guiding them through routes that only exist during specific conditions. And they've taught me that expertise isn't about memorizing surveys or following rules. It's about understanding that caves are dynamic, that knowledge is provisional, and that the marker pointing into darkness might know something the map doesn't. I still wonder sometimes what would have happened if I'd insisted they turn back, if I'd refused to follow them into the passage that the survey said was a dead end. They might have run out of gas fighting current to a distant exit. They might have panicked and made fatal errors, or they might have been fine, proven me right to trust the survey. I'll never know. What I do know is that I chose to follow them, chose to trust their confidence even when it contradicted established knowledge, and that choice led to discovery rather than disaster. But I also know that same choice, in different circumstances, could have killed us all, could have led us deeper into a dead end, trapped us in a flooding passage, used up our gas chasing an exit that didn't exist. The line between good judgment and fatal error is infinitesimally thin in caves, determined by factors you can't always perceive or predict. You make the best choice you can with the information you have, and then you live with the outcome, whether it's survival or something else. The cave keeps its secrets, revealing them only to divers willing to question what they think they know. The transient passages open and close with the water, connecting and disconnecting in patterns that resist complete mapping. The field markers proliferate, adding layers of information that complement and sometimes contradict the official surveys. And divers keep entering the system, following guidelines that might lead anywhere, trusting markers that might be true or false, navigating by a combination of knowledge and intuition and hope. I'll keep diving there, keep searching for the connections that only exist sometimes, keep documenting the cave's hidden modes. Because someone has to. Someone needs to understand that the map and the territory don't always align, that official knowledge has gaps, and that sometimes the arrow pointing into darkness knows the way out better than any survey. Even if following that arrow requires abandoning everything you thought you knew about which direction leads to safety. Even if it means accepting that certainty is just another word for the refusal to see what's actually there, hiding in the spaces between the documented routes, waiting for someone brave or foolish enough to trust the wrong arrow and discover it was right all along.